Austin, Texas. December 6, 1991. It was the kind of winter night where the streets felt quiet early. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving the city wrapped in a thin, cool darkness. Downtown Austin was alive with weekend chatter, bars and restaurants glowing under strings of holiday lights. But just north of the city center, in a small strip mall on West Anderson Lane, the evening air was still. A neon sign flickered against the glass of a modest little storefront. "I can't believe it's yogurt." Inside, the air smelled faintly of vanilla, strawberries, and the sugary tang of chocolate syrup. It was warm, almost cozy. For three of the girls, this was just another night, a shift at work, a few hours behind the counter, chatting in between customers. For the youngest, it was an evening of waiting. Waiting for the ride home, waiting for the weekend to start. 17-year-old Eliza Thomas moved around the counter with quiet efficiency. Tall, with a soft smile and a shy demeanor, she was the type to take her job seriously. She had been working here for months, saving up for her own car. Beside her was another 17-year-old, Jennifer Harbison. Jen was different, outgoing, confident, always quick with a laugh. She had dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Sitting at a table toward the back, legs tucked under her chair, was Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah. She was only 15, still in high school, a little reserved, but with a playful streak her family loved. Beside her sat Amy Ayers, just 13. Amy had begged her parents to let her stay the night with Sarah. They had promised to be home, safe soon. It was close to 10 o'clock. The girls knew closing time was near. They moved through the final motions, wiping down counters, cleaning the yogurt machines, counting the cash register. Outside, the strip mall parking lot was nearly empty. A few cars glided past on Anderson Lane, headlights glowing in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a pair of eyes was watching. Witnesses later recalled two young men lingering near the shop. They had been spotted inside earlier, browsing without buying, then slipping back out. Their faces, indistinct in memory, would haunt investigators for decades. At 10:42 p.m., the last customer walked out the door. Eliza locked it behind them. Inside, laughter echoed briefly. Teenage girls teasing each other, making plans, filling the silence with the normalcy of youth. None of them knew that behind the thin glass door, danger was about to step inside. The details of what happened next will never be fully known. What is certain is this: in the minutes between closing time and midnight, the yogurt shop became a place of terror. The front lock was undone. Whether by force or under threat, no one can say. The intruders moved quickly. The girls were overpowered, bound with whatever the attackers could find: strips of fabric, their own clothing. By midnight, smoke was curling into the cold air outside. A passing patrol officer noticed the strange glow. Flames licked the front windows. Within minutes, firefighters arrived, breaking through the glass to battle the blaze. Inside, the smoke was thick and acrid. Plastic had melted into black puddles, the air hot enough to sting lungs in a single breath. And there, among the scorched remains of what had been a cheerful little dessert shop, the firefighters made a discovery that would haunt Austin forever. For bodies bound, gagged, and left in positions that spoke of brutality. The fire had burned away much, but not enough to hide the truth. All four girls had been shot in the head. Two had been sexually assaulted. Amy, the youngest, had clung to life even after the shot. Evidence suggested she had been burned alive. The fire had been no accident. It was a deliberate, calculated effort to destroy evidence. By dawn, the police tape was up, the street closed off. Reporters gathered in the gray light, microphones in hand, their breath visible in the morning chill. Parents stood at the edges of the crowd, faces pale, eyes searching for an explanation that would never come. Austin had never seen anything like it. Over the coming days, the city's grief hardened into something else: fear. Parents began locking their doors earlier. Teenagers stopped walking home at night. Even the smell of smoke could set nerves on edge. And for investigators, the case became an all-consuming maze. Evidence was scarce. The heat of the fire had destroyed fingerprints, erased fibers, and rendered most of the crime scene a ruin. But there were leads. Witnesses recalled the strange men. The register was found open, money gone. rumors spread of a robbery gone wrong, though nothing about the scene felt simple. The Austin Police Department called in the FBI and the ATF. A .22 caliber pistol and a .380 were believed to be the murder weapons. The search widened to every pawn shop, every criminal informant, every whisper in the city's underbelly. And then as days turned into weeks, the calls began. Anonymous tips, confessions from drifters, drunken brags in bars. One name would rise above the rest, a name that for years police believed held the key to the entire case. But chasing that lead would lead Austin's detectives into one of the most controversial investigations in Texas history, one that would unravel in a way no one expected. Music swells, then cuts abruptly to silence. Narrator low, ominous, and as the years passed, one truth would become undeniable. Whoever killed the girls, and I can't believe it's yogurt, was still out there. Fade to black, and a part one, opening. Slow, pulsing bass line under faint police radio chatter. Narrator steady, reflective. In the weeks that followed the murders, the investigation became a race against time. Every hour that passed felt like an opportunity lost. Detectives pored over what little evidence had survived the fire. A few bullets, fragments of rope, and a trail of whispers that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere at once. The city wanted answers. The families needed them. But answers were slippery, refusing to take shape. At first, police leaned into the robbery theory. The register was empty, after all. But seasoned investigators knew. Most robbers wanted cash, not bodies. This was different. It was deliberate, personal, cruel. Still, any lead was better than none. And soon, one name began to surface. A 19-year-old named Maurice Pierce. Narrator more intense. Pierce was no stranger to trouble. Known for petty theft and carrying weapons, he had been stopped by police in a mall parking lot with a .22 caliber pistol in his waistband. That caliber matched one of the guns used in the yogurt shop murders. When asked about it, Pierce claimed he'd lent the gun to a friend named Forrest Wellborn, and that Wellborn had confessed to killing the girls. It was exactly the kind of lead detectives needed. Within days, police brought in Wellborn for questioning. He denied everything, but that didn't stop investigators from leaning harder, looking for cracks in his story. Soon, the case expanded to include two more young men, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. They all knew each other. They all had troubled pasts, and police believed they all fit the profile. In 1999, almost 8 years after the murders, the pressure boiled over. Detectives pulled Springsteen and Scott into long, grueling interrogations. Hours stretched into days. The questions became sharper. The rooms grew smaller, and eventually both men broke. They confessed, on paper. Their statements told a horrifying story. For young men entering the yogurt shop just before closing, a robbery spiraling into violence, the girls bound and gagged, a fire lit to hide the evidence. The public wanted to believe it. So did the families. After years of dead ends, here it was, a confession, a resolution, a chance for justice. But there was one problem. There was no physical evidence, not a fingerprint, not a fiber, not a single hair connecting any of the men to the crime scene. What the prosecution did have were the taped confessions. But even those fell off. In Springsteen's version, certain details didn't match the crime scene. In Scott's, timeline shifted. Neither man's confession lined up perfectly with the other, and the two suspects had never been questioned together, meaning each version of events lived in its own bubble. Despite this, the trials went forward. In 2001, Robert Springsteen was convicted and sentenced to death. In 2002, Michael Scott was convicted and given life in prison. For a moment, it seemed like the case was closed. But under the surface, the cracks were widening. Defense attorneys argued that the confessions had been coerced, the product of exhaustion, pressure, and leading questions. There was no hard proof, they said, because their clients hadn't been there at all. And then DNA changed everything. In 2008, advances in forensic science allowed for new testing on evidence from the crime scene. From the charred remains, investigators had salvaged a small amount of biological material, enough to identify a YSDR DNA profile. It didn't match Springsteen. It didn't match Scott. It didn't match Pierce or Wellborn. In fact, it didn't match anyone police had tested. The men convicted of the yogurt shop murders were suddenly looking less like killers and more like victims of a flawed investigation. In 2009, after nearly a decade behind bars, all charges against Springsteen and Scott were dropped. The courtroom was silent as the words were read, not in triumph, not in relief, but in confusion. The families were left with nothing but questions. If not them, then who? Detectives had no answers. The unknown male DNA became the new focus of the investigation, but attempts to match it through national databases were blocked by privacy laws. Years passed, leads dried up, the case went cold again, and yet the file never closed. In 2020, new testing was performed on that mysterious DNA. The result was crushing. The match they thought they had, a partial profile in the FBI's database, was ruled out. It was back to square one. Still, Austin Police Detective Dan Jackson refused to give up. Every few months, he would pull the file, review the evidence, and wonder if technology might finally catch up to the crime. Because somewhere that DNA belongs to someone, and somewhere that someone walks free. But in 2025, the case would take on a life of its own again, not in a lab, not in a courtroom, but on television screens across America. A 4-part HBO Max documentary, The Yogurt Shop Murders, would revisit the crime in haunting detail. It would put the story back in the public eye, with never-before-seen footage, emotional interviews, and the kind of spotlight cold cases need. Viewers would watch and wonder in fear, because the story is not over. Somewhere out there, the killer or killers of Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Amy may still be watching too. It's been 34 years. And the question remains, who locked the door that night? After 34 years, the city of Austin has changed. The skyline is taller. The streets are busier. But for the families of Eliza Thomas, Jennifer, and Sarah Harbison, and Amy Ayers, time has been frozen since December 6, 1991. The photographs on their mantles never age. The chairs at family gatherings remain empty. And the questions, the endless, aching questions, still hang in the air. Detectives working the cold case file have learned to tread lightly. In a crime this old, evidence is fragile, sometimes literally. Paper records fade, tape degrades, witness memories warp under the weight of years. And yet there are still names. Not suspects, officially, but names. Some have been whispered in back rooms for decades. Some belong to people who, back in 1991, lived quietly on the edges of Austin. People who had no reason to be noticed until you start pulling at the threads. One of those threads leads to a man we'll call David. David wasn't part of the original investigation, at least not publicly. He was a transient back then, moving between Austin, San Antonio, and Dallas. He had a history of petty crime, a record for breaking and entering, and a particular fascination with young girls. According to a retired detective, David was spotted near North Lamar Boulevard in the weeks before the murders. He had been seen loitering near the yogurt shop. No one thought much of it, until he suddenly left Austin a week after the fire. Years later, when investigators tracked him down in another state, David denied everything. But his alibi was paper thin, and his DNA was never collected. Why? Because in 1991, DNA testing was in its infancy, and laws didn't require collection for minor crimes. It meant that if David had been there that night, there was no sample to compare against the unknown male profile found at the scene. And then there's Randy. Randy was older, in his 30s, and had a record for violent assaults. He was known to hang around teenagers, buying them cigarettes and beer in exchange for company. People described him as strange and off, but not outright dangerous, until years later, when he was arrested for a brutal home invasion involving a young woman. When cold case detectives interviewed him about the yogurt shop murders, he grew agitated. He refused to answer certain questions. At one point, he even demanded to know whether police still had that rope from the crime scene. No one had mentioned rope. But perhaps the most unsettling figure in the background of this case is a man whose name has never been released publicly. In the late 1990s, a tip came in from a prison informant. The inmate claimed that his cellmate had bragged about being involved in a fire job in Austin years earlier. He allegedly described tying up 4 girls in a store and making sure no one walked out alive. The details matched the yogurt shop murders almost exactly. And yet when police looked into it, they found nothing concrete. No evidence. No confession on record. Just another shadow in a case already full of them. Every time a new name surfaces, the same hope rises. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is the one. But hope is dangerous in a case like this, because for every lead that seems promising, there's another dead end. And still, that unknown male DNA waits. It is the only thing that will end this case. Until then, the killer or killers will remain nothing more than a ghost. In 2024, a new witness stepped forward. Someone who says they saw a man leaving the yogurt shop the night of the murders. Someone who claims they can still remember his face. The problem? He's still alive and still in Austin.